It's a great day to be a TV historian. Welcome to Advanced TV Herstory, where we connect the dots of TV and feminism to American culture and politics. I'm your host, Cynthia Bemis Abrams. Joining us today to connect the dots via the very special episode found in sitcoms mostly from the 70s, 80s, and 90s is author Lee Gambin. We're going to talk in depth about his 2-volume book entitled Tonight on a Very Special Episode, When TV Sitcoms Got Serious. Because you know what? They did get serious. We are fortunate to have Lee Gambin all the way from Australia to tell us about American TV, which in and of itself is something to talk about. As usual, not a lot of chit-chat introduction. We're just going to jump right into it because I am excited to have Lee and his time. It's 5 o'clock here in the Midwest of the United States, and it is crack of dawn down there in Australia. So, Lee, tell us a little bit about how an Australian comes to love all things about American film and TV. You're an author who has written about TV, but also the making of the movie Christine and Cujo and movie musicals from the 70s. You're an American in my book.
Well, thank you for having me. This is an honor. It's a great work that you do, and very important work. So this is something that a lot of Americans and a lot of people from England and so forth get wrong about Australia. We grew up with American content. A lot of our content was American as far as what was aired on television. So we had Australian content available, and it was there, but it was very minimal compared to what was happening on TV programming during the 70s and 80s when I was growing up, and early 90s, where it was mostly American content. So we grew up with amazing programming as well. During the late 70s and into the 80s, it was probably the best programming ever because what you'd have was an array of different stuff. So you'd have all your classic westerns and musicals and horror films and, noir and classic Hollywood stuff. You'd have sitcoms galore, TV series, drama series. We'd have a lot of stuff that was mirrored to what you guys would have had as far as like your programming. So for instance, I definitely recall, the idea of the NBC must-see TV would be here in Australia. It would be like, Channel 7 would do the same thing. So you'd have, Taxi and Cheers and Fame and Hill Street Blues all on the same night. So a lot of the same stuff was here as far as the telecasts went. And a lot of stuff...
Can I interrupt on that for just a second? So then, Did you end up getting cable TV then as well? Because cable really changed the face of American TV in the, by the mid 80s. Most households in the Midwestern United States and out west had cable, and that changed it.
Yeah, cable here came a lot later, so in the sort of early to mid-90s. So probably about a decade later. And that was there was a couple of networks. One was a thing called Foxtel, which would be a range of channels. I think there were maybe 25 different channels. And one would be dedicated to cartoons, one would be dedicated to sport, blah, blah. And I think my family did get it for a while, and I was hooked. I was obsessed with Cartoon Network. I was like, oh my God, it's a whole day of Hanna-Barbera. That's just too much. So yeah, that definitely came later. But as far as formative stuff, and I feel like I think formative stuff is when you're a kid. I really do believe that. I think when you're a child and you're watching stuff and engaging with art, that's when it's really formative and really sort of somehow matters a lot more than other things you find along the way later. But I feel like that was all the three major networks here. So that was Channel 7, Channel 9 and Channel 10. There was also the ABC and SBS. SBS was like world channels, so a lot of foreign, a lot of European content. And the ABC was more sort of geared towards sort of educational content, but there was still series on that and very British. But the rest of it was super American. So you'd have all your sitcoms, all your drama series, all your soap operas, all your daytime talk shows. It was all there. And there was Australian content, Australian drama series mostly. We didn't really do well. We didn't fare well in the sitcom branch. There was a couple of sitcoms. There was a show called Kingswood Country, which was definitely a sort of a rip-off, I guess, or a homage to All in the Family. So it was kind of that thing where Australian content was there, but it was constant American content being poured out. So that's why a lot of people from the States are thrown when someone, down under knows so much about American content. It's just that we grew up with it and fell in love with it. also, and I sort of bring it up a bit now in discussion, about a class divide. So working class people were really into American content, and a lot of like middle class people were very much into British stuff. So there was a really interesting divide there. And I recall that being really kind of impactful on my own sort of growing up. I remember going to like, I think it was like, an animal rights rally, and I had a Laverne and Shirley pin on, and this guy was there and he's like, "What's that?" And I go, Laverne and Shirley. And this is me as a kid, like I was probably 12. And he was like, "Oh, that's awful, boring, terrible American stuff." I was like, we're not in the same world. We're not from the same world. There's a difference here. So that's also something that kind of plays into the factor that, a lot of people loved stuff, and then a lot of people were really snobby to it as well.
You spoke to the formative years and why it is that people sort of think about the TV that they watched growing up as, perhaps not the best TV, but the ones that have stuck with them, the episodes that they remember best. And that's maybe even before they made it into syndication or reruns. And so it's interesting that you've taken on the sitcom special TV episode and the study of it, and for the most part, a chronology that's remarkable. When people talk about representation and seeing themselves on TV, that's not a 30-year-old saying, "Oh, I finally saw myself on TV," although there are some people who had to wait that long to see themselves, but rather it is the disabled person, the child of color, the black kid, the Asian kid, whoever, the kid who's just a nerd. And that resonates, and it's such an important time in life. So I am thrilled that we're going to be able to talk more about some of the special episodes, but I'm still curious. So you've told me that you had a very warm TV in your house. It was on all the time. How is it then that you became first a fan and then an author?
Yeah, good question. I think I was also lucky to have a mum who was really supportive of me being obsessed with movies and TV culture and video culture. So I'd be like a ghoul haunting the aisles of the video shop, and always gravitated to the horror films first and foremost, and would have that, and then had a really healthy, balanced childhood as well. It wasn't just stuck in front of the television. But the other thing was, I think it was because I just fell in love with television. If we're talking about the sitcom thing, sitcoms to me were like a fuzzy blanket. They were very comforting, and that was a wide spread of sitcoms, whether it was, sitcoms that had that warmth inbuilt into them, like Mork and Mindy or Laverne and Shirley, or sitcoms that were kind of, confrontational. And then what I did was just watched a lot of them, and they aired all the time, and they aired a lot of them in the morning. So, for instance, a lot of the sort of classic 60s ones would be in the morning, like Leave It to Beaver and Mr. Ed, etc. And then later in the evening, it would be all the primetime ones that were airing at the same time as they would in America, and then late night ones, and then afternoon ones. So it was just constant. Like, it was always there. There was a big flow of it. And I gravitated to them because, yes, they were comforting. I felt like the characters in them were like friends, which it might sound bizarre, but it's true, and I still feel that way now. And they were also a good way to sort of escape and unwind. There was nothing better than getting home from school and seeing the Golden Girls, things like that, or Mr. Belvedere.
How did you turn this into a career?
So as far as, like, if we're sticking to talking about the sitcom thing in this book, what really resonated with me as a kid was that these shows not only had, the laugh tracks or live audiences, and they were quote unquote funny, they also had stuff going on that was really, really left a massive impression on me. And one of the things was they had a lot of heart. A lot of these shows had heart and warmth, and I would cry at the same time as laugh. And then also at the same time, they would tackle subject matter in a really, really sort of, succinct way, which was, obviously made for 24 minutes or whatever to deal with it. And that always threw me. So when there was a show that was generally comedic, and then one episode turns up and it's like, oh my God, that just dealt with that. Are you serious? That really stuck with me. So it was kind of like not trauma, but kind of like a real massive, slap in the face, I guess, going, oh my God, this show just did that. It just said that. It just spoke about that. And that stuck to me for me as a kid and then in my teens. And I was like, this is really interesting. So, years of watching, etc., I was like, okay, cool. And then in my late teens, I started, like a lot of kids here in Australia and America, definitely came from America, a fanzine. So I started fanzines on horror films, and that led me to writing for Fangoria. And I always wrote. I always wrote in journals. I always wrote, and I just sort of buried it and hid it away. But then I was like, nah, this is cool. I'm going to start doing this. I like writing. I think I'm okay at it. And then I got the job at Fangoria, and that just led to everything else. So then it led to book deals. It led to me working on monographs and books. I work now heavily in Blu-ray distribution, so basically doing lots of features, audio commentaries. And now, it's like I think we're on to maybe 15, 16 years of this professional life as a critic and historian and writer and author. So it's fun. It's great. I don't live in a mansion, but it's wonderful work and it's fun and I love it. And I love films and TV, and it's allowed me to sort of embrace that love and make a career out of it.
Well, that is inspiring for all of our listeners who see themselves as fans, or maybe, have full-time careers, but also feel strongly that their love of a certain TV show or series or genre or something can go in other directions. I think we are at a point with the internet and the rise of people feeling confident in their own voices and their opinions, that we no longer just look to the critic from the New York Times or the local paper, but rather we are finding out that there are some really smart people out there who care about the things that we do. So, Lee Gambin, you're inspiring people.
Oh, you are too. I mean, the thing is, as well, just jumping on what you just said there, I think there's a lot of academics, a lot of critics who have an arm's length relationship with what they're writing about, and there's a lot of that. So I grew up reading a lot of film books, right? Like a lot of critical writing, and a lot of the writers, not all, but a lot, a good portion of them, didn't really seem to love what they were writing about. So they'd spend like a whole book sort of, really not, having kind of a warm connection to this stuff. And I just don't like that. I get turned off from that. So I feel like if you're going to be spending a couple of years with the subject, why on earth would you if you don't really care about it? I don't understand. So I think that is exactly what you're saying. Like that whole thing of, I think it starts off being a fan. I think you've really got to love the stuff, and then your heart is open to it and warm to it, and then you can, work on this great stuff around it, whether it's critical or production history or, interviews, all that sort of stuff. It's really, really vital, I think, to be in love with what you're doing.
Absolutely. And the mastery that you've exhibited as the editor, the compiler, the godfather of these two books tonight on a very special episode is that it isn't just you writing this. You've in fact, corralled 3 contributors. And so you have found others who are either academics or they are, entertainment writers, or they are just hardcore fans who know the backstory, who understand the characters, who are able to describe. So it's not just a synopsis, but in many cases is really in depth. And it's also in many cases from an Australian's point of view, which makes no assumptions then. I found value that these were people who slowed down and actually revisited the context of the year that the episode took place. In some cases, not all cases. And sometimes you just have to realize that not everybody has lived the American history of the 80s, 90s, and 2000s as adults. If you were a kid in 1988, you maybe didn't totally understand what was going on politically or culturally at the time. So good job in bringing along you shepherded quite a group.
Thank you. Yeah, and they're all very diverse and diverse voices, and you just hit the nail on the head. Some are like, hardened academics. Some are well-regarded or well-established critical writers or entertainment writers or film or TV historian writers. And some are brand new. Some people are brand new. Some of them, it's their first gig. There was a lot of vetting. There was a lot of, but yeah, it was great. And also the perspectives and different angles that they had. Like, it was really cool to hear different voices on varied shows. And younger people on there as well who were probably not even born when some of the stuff was aired, which is terrific. And they weren't coming in from an angle of, this is dated, because I actually cringe at all that. They were basically speaking from, this perspective of, this is a piece of art. How do we talk about this? Or how do I personally to talk about this? Because I wanted that sort of idiosyncratic, very unique voice to each piece. And then some people were really thorough about production history and what was going on and the writing room and all that stuff, which was fabulous. And then there were other people who were just very much focused on analysis. And then there were other people who did both. They married both. And I like to do that personally with all my work. I like to have a nice marriage of both production history and analysis. I think it's important to do both. And the fun thing was like choosing the episode. I'd steer them in a direction so they basically would reference certain things that would correlate with the episode they were in discussion of. So that way you could sort of have those episodes peppered throughout the book so they were kind of represented, even though they're not meaty enough to have their own, to warrant an own chapter. I wrestled with the structure, actually. Initially, I was going to do it as a thematically based one. So like a chapter on, sexual assault, a chapter on drug addiction. But then what happened was like, there's a few sitcoms that do one topic, but, very few that do one other. So like, it was too hard to sort of distinguish what that would look like. So I thought, okay, let's do a sort of a chronological sort of view and start with sort of very early examples before the thing became an actual fad, before it became something as a go-to. And then, of course, that would start really heavily in the 70s. But there were definitely episodes of sitcoms that I recall as a kid from the 50s and 60s that really stood out to me as something that was more than just sort of the generic or just the regular show, that, the regular sort of turnout of the show. It was actually a little bit more sort of eye-opening, or there was something a bit off about it. And I remember seeing, say, for instance, the Addams Family episode, the Addams Family Meet a Beatnik. And I was like, this show there's no laugh track for ages. But what the hell is going on? And I was obsessed with that show. And I was like, this is very different and weird. And then as a teenager and then as an adult, rewatching it, the show's all about the age gap, the generation gap. And it makes total sense that the Addams Family are the sort of bridge between this young man and his father. The Addams Family being so much about family and love and compassion and support for one another, but also being deemed oddball by the, I guess, quote unquote, normal world. So there was that really beautiful sort of tie about how, the marriage between the generation gap and acceptance and tolerance during a period, sort of pre-hippie, during the beatnik sort of movement, I guess, as well.
So the construction of the books, the full comprehensive set is 1956 to 1998. And I did listen to another podcast where Lee was talking a bit about the book. And for some really good reasons, 1998 is kind of where the whole thing hits a dry spell. And the role of sitcoms is very different. The audiences are different. Those impressionable young people are getting their entertainment elsewhere. So talk just for a second, I guess, tell us what some of those series were in the 50s and the 60s, kind of that would prompt us to say, oh, wow, it was evolving at that point.
Absolutely. So you had things like on Mr. Ed, there was an animal rights episode. On Bewitched, you had that race relations episode. Also, Bewitched, as you know, is so wonderfully feminist. And also there was like episodes where Samantha had to sort of counter-react to people's perceptions of what witches were or who witches were and what they looked like and what they acted like, etc. And a lot of that combative stuff had to come between her and her husband. You had things such as Leave It to Beaver dealing with alcoholism and divorce. So they were sort of peppered around these shows coming here and there. And a lot of the writers on these shows would actually eventually start working for the likes of people like Lear, etc. They sort of developed. They were really young during this period and then sort of developed into their later careers into the sort of realm of the Norman Lears, etc. But so that whole thing was sort of starting to happen, race relations. There was a lot of stuff that was dealing with, Cold War anxiety. There was all these things that were sort of coming about during that period. But as you said, it definitely sort of changed landscape and changed perceptions when we got to the 70s. So
before we start talking about Norman Lear, because that's opening a whole new chapter, I'm curious about one thing, and that is with these older episodes of Mr. Ed and Leave It to Beaver. And I mean, I think about Room 222, which was, well, it definitely would have had some of this content, but it was actually, that was much more the base of the drama. How do you watch these? I mean, so many of them you just can't get on DVD or see on streaming.
Oh, right. Well, a lot of them I do have. Like, a lot of them came out. So things like Mr. Ed and Leave It to Beaver, they all had DVD releases, which I own. Petticoat Junction, Beverly Hillbillies. Bewitched. I've got the whole box sets. So like, they do exist on DVD. Some of them don't, but most of them did, and they came out at the sort of dawn of DVD. No, I was lucky enough to work in a DVD shop, so I just bought them all the time. I'd basically spend all my salary on box. And I'm actually just looking now at my shelf, my TV shelf, and it's just packed. And you don't want to get rid of them because home media is where it's at. I feel streamers are terrible. They edit things, they get rid of episodes, they don't really air much. Whereas DVDs pack them all. They have, there is certain exceptions. For instance, Too Close for Comfort, the DVD center that doesn't have that episode that's mentioned in the book. But so all this stuff on disc, a lot of it is, which is great. And then for certain stuff that I was like, oh my God, how do I find it? For instance, like Chico and the Man, which is a later show, of course. That isn't on disc. Someone released like a really dodgy bootleg of like a few episodes, but that was really hard. I had to go into archive to find the episodes for that I needed. So there was ways around things. And then you've got companies like, sorry to digress, but there's companies like Shout Factory who do beautiful work on the sets. The Maud box set is beautiful, and the Facts of Life box set is amazing.
I have the One Day at a Time box set right now. So I am a big proponent of physical media. We just don't quite understand the kind of, for the generation that grew up being able to go to the video store and the liberty, the liberation that feeling was, that all of a sudden you didn't have to wait for Casablanca to come around on the Thursday night movie on cable, but rather you could just rent it and watch it at your convenience. If you think about it, streaming can give and streaming will take away, or worst case is the next month it will come back and you will have to pay extra for that particular series. So why wouldn't you spend $6.99 on a boxed set, or $6.99 even on a single season? Add it all up and it's $30, but then you'll own it forever.
That's right.
All right, Norman Lear, go.
Yeah, so obviously what happens is you see this transition in television. You have things that are really fascinating going on during the late 60s into the 70s, things like the quote-unquote rural purge, right? So CBS, cancelling a lot of their rural set shows to make way for more inner-city-based shows. You had transitions in culture that was sort of steering away from your escapist fantasy sitcoms like your Gilligan's Island and your Genies and stuff, and wanting to have more grounded realism. So Norman Lear comes in and he basically says, we've got this format known as the sitcom. Let's say something with it. Let's give this meat. Let's scare audiences. Let's, I guess to quote Pauline Kael, frighten the horses. And he was, very politically motivated. That these shows are, incredibly, wonderfully leftist and solid and strong writers create these complex characters that deal with issues constantly. Like All in the Family is a tricky one because every episode seems to be kind of topical, right? Even if it's like a not so obvious. But what was
edgy,
happening?
Yeah, at least edgy.
Absolutely. And what was happening, though, at the same time was this kind of marriage of message picture stuff that was sort of very prominent in the late 50s and into the 60s, sort of bleeding into television. So you have TV starting to take on topics. And TV is, by its very nature, very issues-based. This is where you get your news from. This is where current affair programs come on, talk shows, all that sort of stuff was happening on television. So it makes total sense that dramatic works would also be topical. So made-for-TV movies would be thematic-based, and that was a big deal. A lot of them were ripped from the headlines or dealt with social issues. And at the same time, TV sitcoms started to do this in the 70s onwards. So Norman Lear, yes, was definitely a spearheading, someone who spearheaded this sort of movement. And then by the 80s, jumping into the 80s, it became a big deal to sort of have the quote-unquote very special episode that really would stick out and become something that audiences would remember because it was so outside of the norm. The sort of, I guess, the cynic viewer, the cynical viewer, the person who was sort of would critique this, would see a lot of these shows doing it as kind of a bit of a ratings grab, not really genuinely invested in the actual topic at hand. But I don't know, I think most of them did a really good job, or, they did a job at sort of trying to detail this sort of social issue that they were trying to tackle. You also saw trends in certain aspects. So you'll have certain shows that will sort of, one show will do an episode about a certain situation, and then another show a couple of weeks later will do the same. You see a lot of the very special episodes popping up a lot around Christmas time. So you have this kind of trend where it's ratings pull and also sort of cashing in on what's going on around the culture and also around what the other networks and other shows are doing. But I feel like the most interesting very special episodes that I feel that we included in the books were the ones that were probably to a sort of an audience as I would not be considered a very special episode, because I think a lot of people see a very special episode as very, very clearly defined about some kind of social ill. And that's not always the case. I think the most interesting ones were the ones that were kind of more subtle in their approach, or even like dealing with something that is far more complex and grey in area than something so blatant as, Punky Brewster, don't take drugs. So it's kind of more the message being a little bit more subtle, a little bit more.
Yes, when Nancy Reagan makes a guest appearance, you know that you've just kind of lost half the audience.
That's right. And I love that you brought that up, because that's really interesting, and in the fact that conservatives start to use a medium that they hated initially to peddle their ideas. So, if you think of All in the Family, that enraged Nixon. Nixon wanted that show pulled off the air. Conservatives hated that show because it put a mirror up on America and said, well, Archie Bunkers exist. And so when you get to the 80s and you have different strokes and Nancy Reagan makes an appearance to sort of mention, to push the Just Say No campaign, etc., it's kind of interesting. It's like a big flip. It's like now using this medium to sort of present a conservative agenda.
Fun TV fact, Nancy Reagan was not the first lady to be on a television sitcom. In fact, it was Betty Ford in an episode of Mary Tyler Moore.
That's
where
right.
She played herself, and she said she's calling because Mary didn't believe that Lou had attended Lou attends an event and says, "Oh my God, I was driven home by so and so, and Mrs. Ford was there, and she's lovely." And Mary's like, "No, that didn't happen." And she says, "Yes." He says, "Yes, it did." And so even when Betty calls, and that's the one little cameo, and like preserved forever, Mary still thinks it's all just a hoax. So
that's right.
When it's wildly obvious and Nancy Reagan shows up, you know that you're having some talking points peddled, some public service announcement happening courtesy of, 23 minutes of your favorite show. But you're right. There were many very subtle episodes, or some that just really turned the Rubik's Cube, the ethical Rubik's Cube, in enough different ways so that you can understand why, particularly if you're a 12-year-old or a 10-year-old viewer, why something isn't black and white, why there are so many shades of gray. You have any that you can think of where they sort of did some layers?
Absolutely. And a lot of it dealt with characters. So a lot of times, a lot of very special episodes will involve an outside character you never see again. Or, you might see him in a follow-up episode. For instance, when Tom Hanks turns up on Family Ties, he's the drunken uncle and he turns up on 2 episodes. But we never hear about him again. It's always just those 2 episodes that he sort of exists in, right? But when shows deal with a character who's a mainstay and they're dealing with situations at hand that are there to stay or propel their character forward, or even just linger as an additive to their character, that's when I think it's a little bit different. It's not so, overt and obvious and, blunt. So if you think of Mork and Mindy, for instance, which I mentioned earlier, there's like an episode where Mindy is dealing with the death of her mother or dealing with the grief of that. And that sort of is something that kind of continues throughout the series as something that's part of her as a character, because you can't escape that. That's something that's going to, even though it's an episodic television show, it's still a part of her character, so therefore it's going to pop up here and there. So there's an episode of Mummy for Mindy where she sort of deals with coping with grief, and Mork, of course, helps her. And it's really moving and it's really beautiful, and, this sort of profound performance from the stunning Pam Dorber, who is so underrated, just a wonderful actress. And this character really kind of does grow, and it's about grief and it's about coping methods of grief and acceptance, etc. But it's not so overtly about that in the realm of advertising that it's about that. So the promos for that were never going to be, next on a very special episode of Mork and Mindy. It was just part and parcel of this character's development. So I think that's really fascinating when things like that happen. So it's kind of not so overt or obvious. And then there were shows, for instance, like Gloria's Boyfriend from All in the Family, which deals with neurodivergent people. So Richard Massou plays a character who is in this sort of scope of the world. You'd call him autistic on the spectrum. And it's beautifully handled. And he's obviously this wonderful secret genius, right? Because he outwits, it's very easy to outwit Archie Bunker, but he outwits other characters and it's really sweet. But also the love that Gloria shows him. And that episode kind of just sort of feels like a regular All in the Family episode without it being sensationalistic, the way, say, Edith's sexual assault was handled, where it was like a big sensation, like it was promoted as something that was quite, a big TV event. So I think that's the difference. And you mentioned PSAs, and that's another thing that I feel is a big core inspiration of these shows, the PSA thing, the idea of presenting entertainment format as an infotainment thing, where basically you're saying, this is the message, this is the core message, generally geared towards younger people, and we're going to really, really enforce that message down your throat. And I think shows like Different Strokes really did that. And as wonderful as that show is, it does do that really heavy-handedly. So you have Conrad Bain at the beginning looking directly into camera, talking at you. And that used to scare me as a kid. I was like, this is so otherworldly and weird. He's staring right into my soul, telling me what we're going to see is going to be harrowing. So, of course, he stuck around.
Hello, I'm Conrad Bain. Tonight on Different Strokes, we're starting a special 2-part show on a very sensitive and important subject. Now, we urge families, children, and parents alike to watch both of these informative episodes and then to discuss the problem presented, which is of deep concern to all of us.
That kind of thing was really heavy, sort of hammered. Whereas, mentioning things like the Mork and Mindy episode of Gloria's Boyfriend, and there's a plethora of others, they were far more subtle and not driven as or promoted as this sort of sensationalistic TV. But by the time you get to things like Facts of Life and Different Strokes, which seem to me hold the biggest number of VSEs, of very special episodes, that was when they could actually really, really market these things as an entity, as something that's kind of culturally important and also pop culturally a phenomenon, rather than just sort of part and parcel of the show. So if you think of Mary Tyler Moore, if you think of those shows, they have a lot of social topics covered, but they were always sort of weaved into the fabric of the narrative of the show. They were never really treated as, this is the time Mary deals with this, or this is, it was always kind of just part of this show.
Wow. Lee Gambin knows his stuff. His insights into American TV and the knowledge of our history and culture is extraordinary. Thank you, Lee, for being my guest and for all you're doing to preserve TV herstory and history. Are you interested in more of my behind-the-scenes musings, research, and work? Sign up for our e-newsletter at tvherstory.com. Please know your information will never be sold or shared. My thanks as well to Mary Lou Morose for her attention to audio detail and clip stitchery. Our music is Take Me Higher by a musician named Jazzer and is found at freemusicarchive.org. Links for Lee's book, audio clips taken from YouTube, and links to past podcast episodes I've mentioned are in the show notes. Listeners, today we learned the role sitcoms played in providing the public service of educating, building awareness, or layering shades of perspective to remind us that life doesn't always have a laugh track. And that is why I podcast. I'm your host, Cynthia Bemis Abram.